Rescuing the most desperate in Syria's Aleppo, the Red Cross finally managed to evacuate some of the most vulnerable civilians. As thousands of people try to flee the siege in the rebel-held east, the bombardment by government forces continues amid calls for a ceasefire.
These people came through a hole that was smashed through the wall nearby that mosque, and as you can hear, the fighting is still going on.
Also on the programme this lunchtime, the final day of the Supreme Court hearing on Brexit is underway as the 11 justices prepare to consider their verdict on whether MPs should have a say. More than 300 police officers have been accused of using their position to sexually exploit people, including victims of crime. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson slapped down by Downing Street after claiming that Saudi Arabia has been playing proxy wars in the Middle East. New rules on junk food advertising for children from next year. Such ads won't be allowed online or on social media. And the gentle giants, a dramatic fall in the number of giraffes roaming the planet amid warnings they're now vulnerable to extinction.
Here, accident investigators find an aircraft carrying members of Osama bin Laden's family was flying too fast as it crashed on landing. And when dialing 999 doesn't get you an ambulance, but a taxi.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. For the first time since July, the International Committee of the Red Cross says it has managed to evacuate almost 150 elderly and disabled civilians from part of eastern Aleppo. It follows days of fierce fighting in the city's old quarter, where the civilians have been trapped after taking shelter in a former old people's home. East Aleppo has received no aid supplies since July, and thousands of civilians are still under siege there. Richard Galpin reports.
Pro-government forces in eastern Aleppo apparently pressing home their advantage in this video provided by the Syrian military. 3 weeks into their offensive, they've recaptured 3/4 of the rebel stronghold in the city. With opposition fighters and thousands of civilians now pinned down in a rapidly shrinking area in the south, the government is already claiming victory.
The
victory in Aleppo is strategic and will change the way a political settlement is achieved. Now the international community must discuss what it can provide for the Syrian people and send humanitarian aid through the government.
That confidence partly due to the rebels' decision to retreat yesterday from the old city, which had been a bastion of the opposition. And as the pro-government forces retake these areas, emotional reunions for families which have been divided for years. And the Red Cross and Red Crescent have already been able to bring 150 of the sick and injured out of the conflict zone, including children. The first time so many have been taken out for treatment. But elsewhere, the fighting continues. Government forces backed by Russia and Iran determined to inflict a full defeat on the rebels in this key city. And it may not take long if the advance continues at its current pace. Despite the huge humanitarian crisis this is sparking, there's no sign the calls from Western countries for a ceasefire are being listened to. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, government forces now control more than 3/4 of the rebel-held east of the city. A small group of journalists has been taken to one area that's just been captured by the Syrian army. Among them, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
There are no formal humanitarian corridors. No one could agree on them. But there's this. Thousands of people are now fleeing every day, wherever they can, however they can. These people came through a hole that was smashed through the wall nearby that mosque, and as you can hear, the fighting is still going on. They've all come from Salhin, where there's been intense fighting for that area. The Syrian army and its allies have almost moved in, but these people have fled whenever they got a moment. They've lived with years of war, but everyone we speak to says they haven't lived through the fighting that they've had of the last few days. Children speak of being frightened. people living without enough food or water and absolutely no safety. Even the journey here was risky. One woman told me that they tried to escape a few days ago. They came under fire and her husband was killed. So she's here on her own with her 5 children. Everyone here has a terrible story to tell. Not knowing where they'll go now, not knowing when this war will end. They're dependent on handouts, dependent on a course of the war over lives for which they have absolutely no control.
Lise Doucet in Aleppo. Well, this morning, the head of MI6 warned that the United Kingdom is facing an unprecedented threat from terrorism. Alex Younger said Islamic State militants in Syria were currently plotting attacks against the UK and its allies. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale is here, and he was making the point that Britain cannot be safe from the threat of a terrorism threat from Syria until this civil war is brought to an end.
Yeah, and it's difficult to see, what is the end, how this civil war will end. And I think he is concerned. He's talking about Islamic State. Other words he used was a murderously efficient group. British agents, he said, are working in very dangerous environments, with actually mentioning Syria or Iraq, trying to thwart or help thwart attacks, often knowing that if they're found out, that they would face certain death. That MI6, and the reason he gave this speech clearly, was to show that MI6 are working very hard to counter this threat. I think a big concern of his, clearly though, from this speech, was the intervention, the military intervention of Russia to back President Assad. And he said that Russia and Assad are seeking to make Syria a desert and call it peace. Very strong words, clearly worried about the effects that will have, the chaos that will result from that military action inside these ungoverned spaces. And he is someone who wants to make sure that the country knows that they are looking at these threats, dealing with these threats. They have people on the ground and here in London and abroad working to make sure people here stay safe.
Jonathan Beale, thank you. It's the 4th and final day of the government's historic appeal hearing at the Supreme Court on whether Parliament must be consulted before Brexit is triggered. Today, the panel of judges is hearing from representatives of the Scottish and Welsh governments. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth reports.
It's the final day in a case of enormous constitutional and political significance. Arriving this morning, those who argue Parliament should give its approval to start the process of leaving the EU, and those defending the government's right to do it. The papers in preparation, testimony to the weight this case carries. The Supreme Court is deciding who has the power to trigger Brexit. This morning has heard lawyers representing the Scottish and Welsh governments. They argue, like Northern Ireland, they should have a say. Scotland's top lawyer says, by convention, the Scottish Parliament should give its consent.
Fundamentally, I say this case is about who has the power to change the law of the land. The convention constrains the United Kingdom Parliament in the exercise of its legal powers in order to respect the authority which the Scottish Parliament has.
Like Scotland, Wales says the impact of Brexit will be so great, the Welsh Assembly should be consulted.
May I therefore put it bluntly, Wales is not here because it wants either to stop or to stall Brexit or the implementation of Brexit. It is here precisely because the constitutional issues at stake go far beyond Brexit.
When the fascists attack, we fight back!
Those constitutional issues have been thrashed out in this historic case since Monday. For 4 days, there have been protests outside. Even the court acknowledged how divisive the Brexit debate has been and how much it matters to the country.
We are aware of the strong feelings associated with the many other wider political questions surrounding the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union.
But the Supreme Court isn't deciding on Brexit itself, merely who has the legal power to start the formal process, called Article 50. The government says it can, using prerogative powers, a remnant of the era of all-powerful kings and queens. But campaigners say it needs the authority of Parliament, because only an Act of Parliament can take away the rights linked to the EU. Yesterday in Parliament, MPs did vote to start formal Brexit talks by the end of next March, but that vote wasn't binding. And Number 10 said it wouldn't override the court's decision as to whether full legislation was needed. But it was a signal of Parliament's intent. Whatever the outcome of this court case, most MPs don't want to stop or block Brexit. They just want a say in the process. Still, the government, like many, is closely watching what happens here because the court's decision, expected in the new year, could slow down and complicate its plan to enact one of the biggest decisions the country has ever made. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman is at the High Court. So the 11 justices go away after today and consider the lengthy arguments from both sides, and it is not until the new year that we find out what they have decided.
That's right, but the positions couldn't be clearer. The government has fully articulated its case. It says that ministers have the executive power to trigger Article 50, and it says it really for two main reasons. One is that Parliament has never really taken that power away from ministers, and also that the rights that we get through EU law are not full-blown statutory rights. They're something lesser than what's known as treaty rights. Lined up against them, a bombardment from Lord Panic QC for Gina Miller saying, no, it's that place over there. It's Parliament that makes the law. And the government's argument violates fundamental constitutional principles. Ministers can't trigger Article 50. They can only do that with the authority of an Act of Parliament. Now, this afternoon, James Eadie, the government's barrister, has the right to answer that bombardment, to answer the devolution arguments. He will do that this afternoon. After that, it is, as you say, up to the 11 judges, and their ruling is expected in January. Sophie.
Clive, thank you. And our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, is in Westminster. Meanwhile, Brexit MPs are saying that Theresa May has been given a free pass, whatever the court decides.
Well, Sophie, Number 10 has this morning sought to hose down some of its more enthusiastic Brexit supporters, saying no, that Commons majority, however big, is not a knockout blow for Brexit. It doesn't give Mrs May a blank cheque, and no, it doesn't trump any decision by the High Court, by the Supreme Court. And Number 10 are pretty clear. If the Supreme Court decide there has to be legislation, there will be legislation, even if that means MPs seek to amend it and thereby possibly to delay or even thwart Mrs May's plans, despite that massive majority last night. But the fact Number 10 has had to calm down some of the Brexiteers, I think, underlines just how divisive this debate is becoming, with a ferocious backlash this morning against the decision by the Conservative Party to name and shame those Labour MPs on Twitter who spoke out against Brexit. One of them this morning challenging Mrs May to disown that sort of conduct. And I think it reflects a wider disquiet about how explosive this debate is becoming, where critics are being branded as enemies of the people.
Norman Smith in Westminster, thank you. An inspection of police forces in England and Wales has revealed that over the past 2 years, more than 300 officers have been accused of using their position to sexually exploit people, including victims of crime. The Inspectorate of Constabulary said the abuse of authority for sexual advantage was now the most serious form of corruption facing the police service. Danny Shaw reports.
Policemen who became predators. These are some of the officers who exploited their position for sexual gain. The most notorious case involved PC Stephen Mitchell, jailed in 2011 for raping and indecently assaulting vulnerable women he met while on duty in Newcastle. The Inspectorate of Constabulary says there are hundreds more cases, and police aren't doing enough to tackle the problem.
You might have women who officers encounter as victims of domestic abuse or victims of other sexual offences. There might be women that police officers have arrested in the course of their duties. There might be, in a few cases, vulnerable underage girls. So the common factor, if you like, is a relationship of power that the officer abuses. They are there as the guardian and they become an abuser.
In the 2 years to the end of March, 334 police officers and staff were accused of sexual offences. In total, there were 436 separate allegations, but fewer than half, 48%, were referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Inspectors say that's a cause for concern. People under investigation or suspected of criminal activity are among those most at risk of a sexual approach by an officer. Sex workers are particularly vulnerable.
What we are seeing is a number of things, from police using databases to stalk and harass and target sex workers, going to their home addresses, that kind of thing, but also demanding free sex and even rape in some cases.
Senior officers agree it's the most serious form of corruption facing policing.
Unfortunately, like any other walk of life, we do have individuals within the police service who will behave in this way, and we need to target them, and we need to root them out, and we need to kick them out of the service.
The number of police personnel involved in abuse is a small proportion of the workforce, but a national strategy is now being developed to combat the problem. Danny Shaw, BBC News.
The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has been slapped down by Downing Street after he accused Britain's ally Saudi Arabia of engaging in proxy wars in the Middle East. A spokeswoman said his comments were not the government's position. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landell is here, and this has emerged after footage came out of Boris Johnson speaking at a conference in Rome.
Yeah, the Foreign Secretary was taking part in a question and answer session, and he made the argument that in his view in the Middle East there's not enough leadership, and because of that lack of leadership, other countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran are filling those vacuums with what he called proxy wars and puppeteering. Now, that's an analysis that many people wouldn't actually disagree with. The problem is it's not government policy. Government policy is saying, no, we're supporting the Saudis in their conflict, particularly in Yemen, because we think that conflict potentially poses a real threat to Saudi. Saudi are a big allies of the United Kingdom. That's why we're supporting them. So as a result of that, Downing Street today have been uncompromising in saying, no, what the Foreign Secretary said is not the government's position. The government's position remains that we support the Saudis in their attempts to protect their borders and protect their allies. So a pretty robust slapdown, I think, from Number 10 on the Foreign Secretary. And it's tricky because he's going to Saudi Arabia at the weekend, so he's going to have to explain all of this just at a time when the British government's trying to do whatever it can to engage with the region, because they know they're going to need a lot of trade there after Brexit. So not a row that Number 10 wanted.
James Landell, thank you. The time is coming up to 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. As thousands of people try to flee the siege in Aleppo, the Red Cross finally manages to evacuate some of the most vulnerable civilians there. And still to come, a solid day for England in the fourth test against India, as new opener Keaton Jennings scores a century on his debut.
Stay with us for South Today. We'll have more detail on the ambulance trust that's sending taxis to take patients to hospital so it doesn't run out of ambulances. And Saints prepare for a crunch game in their European adventure as their opponents train at St Mary's.
Now, from next year, adverts like these that are promoting junk food online to children will be banned. There are already similar rules in place on advertising food or drink on TV, which is high in fat, salt or sugar. But this new ban will affect social media, ads that are online and in print and at the cinema. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson reports.
I'm going to have to say caramel apple.
Finley and Pip, like many children their age, they spend more time on the internet than watching the television, and that's why there's concern about the number of junk food adverts targeting them.
When you watch these ads, does it make you feel at all hungry?
Yeah, it is.
And what did it make you want to eat?
Well, the only food I was looking at.
Sweets
really.
and junk, really.
Yeah.
It did actually make you...
Yeah, it generally did, but that was the whole point in them, really. But they've done a good job of it.
From next summer, new rules will ban all non-broadcast adverts of food and drink high in fat, salt or sugar, targeting under 16-year-olds. In particular, that means online adverts on social media, video sharing and games websites for children. The restriction will also apply to sites where more than 25% of the audience are children. But campaigners say that's not enough and there will be loopholes.
So there might be YouTube platforms and shows where children are watching, but so are adults. And just because adults make up more of the target audience, it doesn't mean that there's still not lots and lots of children watching this. And the same for TV. So we've got family-based programmes like X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, that aren't necessarily captured within these restrictions. So children are still exposed to the adverts there.
But the self-regulated industry body which is introducing the new restrictions says they do go far enough.
The consensus view from our public consultation suggests we've got the balance just about right. Where children do see ads for these products, they're also subject to our other rules that prevent pester power, that prevent misleading nutrition and health claims.
Lucky Charms cereal.
These are a few of the adverts which have targeted children online this year, and experts say the new rules must work because of the big impact they can have.
I think that it's incredibly powerful because you can do many more things than you can in a 30-second or 60-second ad. You can tell stories, you can use celebrities, vloggers and so on. You can get people to, develop their own games around brands and so on. So young children are being influenced by it, they're engaging with it in a completely different way to the TV ads that they also see.
That's where she's replaying.
The new restrictions will also apply to cinemas, magazines and billboards, part of plans to try to protect children like Finley and Pip and younger from childhood obesity. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Scientists at Oxford University say some people being sectioned with schizophrenia actually have an immune disorder. A study published in The Lancet Psychiatry found some patients had antibodies in the blood that could disrupt the function of brain cells. The researchers say this could be the cause of their psychotic symptoms. The finding is controversial, but may open up a new way of treating patients, as our health correspondent James Gallagher reports.
I really like playing the piano because it's just a beautiful sound.
Being able to play again is a sign Sarah's treatment is working. It's now 3 years since she was sectioned with psychosis.
So I hallucinated that my body had morphed. It's normally into animal shapes, so grown spider's legs and grown rabbit ears, and I get strange ideas in my head that someone's trying to kill me or that I have to kill someone, and then a lot of it in the more recent episodes has resulted in self-harm.
Tests on her blood discovered something unusual in her immune system. Antibodies should protect the body, but instead Sarah's were attacking the surface of her brain cells, disrupting their function. 3 in 100 people have an episode of psychosis at some point in their lives. The study, published in The Lancet Psychiatry, looked at more than 200 patients developing symptoms for the first time. It found 1 in 11 patients had similar antibodies to Sarah in their blood.
Receptors in those.
Professor Belinda Lennox conducted the research. She says this could transform treatment for some patients.
It is a really exciting advance and breakthrough, and every psychiatrist and every patient with psychosis needs to be aware of this, and to look for it and to treat it assertively when we find it.
Sarah feels close to her best after being treated with drugs to calm her immune system. She even had her blood filtered to remove antibodies. This emerging field is exciting some doctors, but not all are convinced. A trial's now underway to find out if this approach can help patients. James Gallagher, BBC News.
Profits at Sports Direct have fallen by a third in the first half of the year. The retailer owned by Mike Ashley has had a troubled year after being criticised by MPs about working practices at its warehouse and its use of zero-hour contracts. Our business correspondent John Moylan is here, and they really are terrible results for them, aren't they?
Yeah, big fall in profits after a terrible year for the firm. Its shares down 8% today, one of the biggest fallers on the stock market. Why? The company talking today about strategic challenges. What is clear is that it took a big hit on the pound after the Brexit vote. It looks like it didn't insure itself, it didn't hedge itself for that possibility. And I think the worry for shareholders is that it's saying today these problems could persist into the medium term, hence the hit on the share price. Sports Direct and its boss Mike Ashley, of course, hasn't been out of the headlines all year. The taxman is looking into whether it's paying the minimum wage. MPs did that damning report which talked about working practices at its warehouse in Sharbrooke being closer to those of a Victorian workhouse, and it's faced a shareholder revolt at its AGM.
And interesting that the company has actually launched quite an attack on their critics.
Yeah, the chairman today putting its hand up and saying, look, the board accepts responsibility for its shortcomings, but talking about disproportionate, inaccurate and misleading commentary, an extreme political union and media campaign, which he says has damaged the reputation, influenced customers and hit morale. I think a lot of critics would say, well, it's brought a lot of this upon itself, and perhaps today, in a sign of the mindset at the firm, it's doing something which could well lead to more headlines in the future. It says it's going to spend £40 million on a corporate jet.
John Moylan, thank you. US President-elect Donald Trump has chosen a climate change skeptic to run the US Environmental Protection Agency. Scott Pruitt, the Attorney General of the oil-rich state of Oklahoma, is seen as a close ally of the fossil fuel industry and has spent years opposing the policies of the agency he will soon lead. Greg Lake, the lead singer with the influential supergroup Emerson, Lake and Palmer, has died of cancer at the age of 69.
They said there'll be snow at Christmas. They said there'll be peace on earth.
He found success initially with the band King Crimson before joining Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer in London in 1970. To get together, they created hit albums including Pictures at an Exhibition, Trilogy and Brain Salad Surgery. Greg Lake also wrote the song I Believe in Father Christmas. English cricket's new opener, Keaton Jennings, had a day to remember on the first day of the fourth test against India. The South African-born batsman scored a century in his maiden innings. Our correspondent Patrick Geary reports.
Keaton Jennings has come a long way to get here. Born in South Africa, adopted by Durham, now opening for England in Mumbai. He knows as well as anyone cricket's a game of chance. This was his, dropped on 0. For reassurance at the other end was Alistair Cook, who has more than 10,000 test runs to his name. Even he has the occasional rush of blood, though. Cook stumped. But Jennings, just 24, on his first day in the job had settled in fine. All this on a pitch that was spinning, as Joe Root found out. Changing batsmen is a regular occurrence, changing umpires less so. A misplaced throw put Paul Rifle in hospital. Jennings went on, now even playing trick shots. Only the 9th English batsman to score a century on his Test debut, an innings for history and the future. For a time, his confidence was catching. Moeen Ali struck 50. England were flying. The problem for them on this tour is that things unravel quickly. Ravi Ashwin tempted Moeen. Then, a ball later, Jennings finally met his end. But with 112 runs behind him, this is surely just the end of a beginning.
It's been a surreal, I suppose, 7-8 months, and to top it off the way it has with a Test cap and a Test 100 on top, it's kind of the best Christmas present I could get, really.
The accent's not caught up yet, but Jennings says he feels English, not South African. Enough for some, if not all.
It's supposed to be England, where you're born and bred. If you're not born here, at least you're bred here.
You know, he's in the selection process. The selectors are there to pick who they feel is the best players, and I think they've got this one spot on.
The focus for now is more on Jennings' scorecard than his birth certificate. Patrick Geary, BBC News.
The number of giraffes in the world has dropped so dramatically over the past 30 years that the tallest land mammal is now classified as vulnerable to extinction. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature says the giraffe population has decreased by almost 40% in that time. Habitat loss, poaching and civil unrest have all been blamed. Our science correspondent Victoria Gill is at Chester Zoo. Victoria.
Well, we have some animals here, Sophie, who certainly seem to be enjoying this strangely mild December weather. But sadly, the news of these animals' great decline in the wild has not been a surprise to conservationists here, who've been monitoring their population in their native African habitat, as I have been here finding out.
Highly recognisable. But while Chester Zoo's giraffes are loved by visitors, in their natural African habitat, these animals are suffering what's being called a devastating decline.
Here at the zoo, it's easy to get close to the giraffes, especially when you're up on a high feeding platform. They're very used to people. But in the wild, they're naturally curious, and that leaves them vulnerable to poaching.
That illegal hunting, along with expanding agriculture and civil unrest, have all been cited as factors pushing this long-necked mammal towards extinction. A regularly updated global assessment of the world's plant and animal species has today upgraded their conservation status to vulnerable.
Now recognising them as being at threat of extinction on the red list heightens our awareness of the issues they're facing, and in some ways it makes it easier for us to try and tackle those. It gives us an added impetus to try and work with them. So being on the red list, whilst it's bad news in itself, of course, it's showing that they've undergone a massive decline. It's great in that we're focusing on that before the decline is too late.
The list has also shown an increasing threat to many bird species. The African grey parrot, a prized mimic, is now listed as endangered, and that's due in part to unsustainable levels of trapping. In some parts of the continent, numbers of these famously talkative birds have declined by as much as 99%. But while the numbers can make grim reading, conservationists hope the list will spark international action, and that in the midst of an emerging extinction crisis, people can still make space for the tallest mammal on Earth.
Now, I'll try not to get pulled over the fence. Actually, Chester Zoo and zoos like it use these numbers to inform their conservation breeding programmes, like this one here for the Rothschild giraffe. The bigger challenge will be facing some of those issues that are facing African countries where these animals live in the wild. But hopefully this report will be a start.
Victoria, wonderful. Thank you very much. Time for a look at the weather now with Peter Gibbs. Hello.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Those giraffes feeling at home with this mild weather at the moment, I think. A lovely day across the northeast of Wales, but not as mild here, despite the sunshine, as it was yesterday. In fact, across Wales and Northern Ireland, it ended up being the second mildest December day on record. Temperatures getting up to around 16, even 17 degrees. We've just about reached peak mildness now, though. Things set to cool off as we head towards the end of the week. We've got another waft of milder air coming through later tonight and into tomorrow. But after that, well, yes, certainly something cooler coming our way, but still only just about down to where it should be at this time of the year. In fact, in some places staying a little above average. And those southwesterly winds this afternoon still bringing us mild air. Bit of brightness here and there, but quite misty at times around the south coast of Wales, hillier parts of southern England too. Just a few brighter spells breaking through inland. Temperatures well up into the low teens in many places once again, so. But across the East Midlands, southern parts of the Pennines, just the remnants of that rain taking a bit of time to clear away after that wet start to the day. But plenty of brightness to come across Northern Ireland. Not as mild as yesterday here, but pleasant enough across Scotland too, with temperatures in most places getting up into double figures. And then through this evening and overnight, well, here's the next batch of particularly mild air coming our way. Trapped in between these two weather fronts, it doesn't quite reach the northeast of Scotland overnight, so here temperatures will take a bit of a dip, well down into low single figures. Otherwise, though, another mild frost-free night, and quite a cloudy one as well, with outbreaks of rain coming into the mix for Northern Ireland, good part of Scotland as well, later tonight and into tomorrow. And that rain just slowly toppling its way in across the northern parts of England, North Wales. But ahead of that, some brightness breaking through the Midlands, parts of southern England, for example, and it will feel mild once again. The temperatures, the warmest places could get up into the low teens once again, thanks to those southwesterly winds which stay with us, but not quite into the weekend. Big area of low pressure to the north of the UK, bringing a bit of a breeze to northern areas. It's this weather front, though, that's going to be a bit of a pain on Saturday. Could well outstay its welcome. Some uncertainty about how long that rain will linger, but could end up being quite a poor day across southern parts of England and Wales. Elsewhere, apart from a few showers across the northwest of Scotland, a lot of dry weather to come, but certainly feeling cooler and fresher than of late in those brisk westerly winds. But actually by Sunday, we've lost the rain in the south, so Sunday the better day of the weekend for most. Still a few showers around, though, across those northwestern parts of Scotland. But Sophie, certainly no sign of anything wintry at all as far ahead as we can see at the moment.
Peter, thank you. And that's all from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the BBC News team's Where You Are. Bye-bye.